Welcome to our fifth lesson, where we will deal with our background. If you recall, in the original Flappy Bird game, the background is actually moving behind the bird, so we have an impression that our bird is flying and going right. We want to do the same with our game. In order to do that, we have to make a scrolling background, and we have to respawn our background every time we make it to the end of it. First thing we want to do is go to our ground in Scene, go to Inspector, Add Component, go to Physics 2D and add Rigid Body 2D. As you remember, we also added this to our bird, and it actually gave it gravity. We do not want the gravity to affect our background, so we will choose for body type to be kinematic. This way, gravity won't affect it, it will be controlled only by the script. Next thing we should do is make the sky child of the ground. So just drag sky into ground. Now ground is the parent of the sky, and everything that we do to our ground will be applied to sky. So when we move our ground, sky will be moved as well. So they act like one object. In order to make our background scrolling, we have to make a script. We can do that by going to our ground, going to Inspector, Add Component, and just typing the name of our new script. It will be called Scroll. Click on New Script and create an ad. Now, as you can see, we immediately added our scroll script to our ground, and it appears in our project. So let's drag and drop it to our scripts folder, and double-click to open it. If you remember, the first thing we did in our bird script is define rigid body. So let's go ahead and make a variable. It will be private, so type private rigid body 2D. It will be called RB, and in our start method we have to define it. RB equals get component rigid body 2D, and now we can use our rigid body in our script. If we want to make our background to move, we have to add some velocity. So type rb.velocity equals new vector2. Since this is just the background, we will not use forces, we can just add our velocity in the x and y values of our vector2. So x value will be -1, which means it will move to left, and our y value will be 0, since we do not want it to move up or down. Let's go ahead and save it, go back to Unity, and press play to check. Our background is moving, but we reach the end, and that is not okay. Also, when we die, our scrolling does not stop. So we have to state two things. First thing will be scrolling background when we died. So go back to our script, go to our update method, and state, if our bird died, we want our velocity to become 0. That means background stops moving. How can we know when our bird died? If you remember, in game controls, we have one method that says bird died. So we will use this method since we have instance of this script. Go back to scroll script and type if gamecontrols.instance.endgame equals true. So this means if endgame from our game controls class becomes true, we want to stop moving our background. We will do that by removing velocity from our background. rb.velocity becomes vector2.0. Let's save it and see what happens. Our bird has died and the background stopped moving. Now, as you can see, we have reached the end of this background. That's why we have to respawn it to new position. But we cannot respawn this background since we are still using it. We'll make another background and reposition the first one when we get to the second one. In order to do that, we have to duplicate our background, which is our ground. So right-click our ground and find duplicate. Now we have ground and ground 1. As you can see, ground 1 also has the scroll script, so we can modify it from our already open scroll script. Now let's position our ground 1. Zoom out a bit, click on ground 1, and just move it to the right. Make sure that there is no gap between backgrounds. You can do that by clicking play and checking if there is gap on the Game tab. Okay, this is fine by now. Let me explain you what we will do with our background. So this is our ground, and we can measure when our camera hits the end of the first background. So when we move to our second background, our first background will go behind the second background. So they will constantly just spawn behind each other, and that's how we'll get our infinite background. Okay, so how could we measure when will our camera hit the end of our first background? Well, we have this collider to the ground, and we can actually use it. Now let's define two variables. First will be the ground collider that I just showed you, and another one will be total length of our background, which we will get from collider length. So let's make ground collider our variable. It will be private. Box collider 2D, it will be called ground collider. And our horizontal length will be also private. And since there is a possibility that is not a whole number, we will make it float, called horizontal length. Let's define these in our start method. So our ground collider equals getComponent box collider 2D. And our horizontal length is the value of x-axis in our ground collider. So type horizontal length equals ground collider dot size dot x. So now we need to check when our camera has hit the end of our first background. We will do that in our update method. Right underneath this if statement, we will write another one to check if the difference along the x-axis of main camera and the position of the background is less than our ground horizontal length in the negative direction. So this will be clear when we write it. So type if transform position.x, meaning our position x, is less than negative horizontal length times 1.5. If you are wondering why did I write 1.5, I will explain it as soon as we write this statement. So if we move to the end of our first background, we want to reposition the first background to the end of the second one. So transform position becomes new vector 2 with x value horizontal length times 1.5, and our y position will remain the same, and we write that by typing transform.position.y. If you are getting error here on our horizontal length times 1.5, just add f as in float after 1.5. You can do the same in our condition. Let's save everything and let me explain you why did I put 1.5f. So head back to Unity. If you remember, our bird is at the position 0, 0, meaning 0 in the x and 0 in the y-axis. And our background is scrolling to the left, meaning that it's going into the negative position. So if I just wrote minus horizontal length and save this, let me explain you what will happen. So as you can see, with our center, so with our 0 position, we ended our first background and it just disappeared. That's why we need to have that half of our background. In order to do that, we add times 1.5. So when we pass 1.5 of our first background, we reposition. So let's type it correctly in our script. Add 1.5 if you erased it, times 1.5f. Save it and let's see how it looks like now. Okay, so we reached the end of our first background and it repositioned to the end of the second one. And the second one did the same. And this is how you make a scrolling background. Thank you for your attention. This would be all for this lesson.